Have you ever wondered what life is actually like when your father is a billionaire? I'm Fontaine, 33 years old, and believe me, it's nothing like the fairy tale people imagine. My father owns a huge stretch of luxury coastline across the Carolinas. He gives away millions in donations. The watch on his wrist costs more than most houses. Yet on the day I married a man whose hands were covered in engine grease, my father stood at my wedding and erased me from the family with a single sentence. No inheritance. No trust fund. Nothing. My husband simply smiled and answered him with 4 quiet words. The room fell completely silent. My mother cried exactly as everyone expected, but none of them knew where my husband truly worked or what I had quietly built with my own hands while they laughed at me. 6 months later, they would all learn the truth in front of 500 people at the absolute worst moment for my father's empire. Welcome back to Diana True Stories, where people who underestimate others always discover the truth when it's already too late. If you've ever heard a story that touched an old wound you thought had healed, you're in the right place. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe because this story is one you won't want to miss. Now let me take you back to the dinner where my father presented me with an ultimatum and called it love. It was a Thursday evening. We sat around the long dining table overlooking the water my father loved to claim as his own. He didn't own the ocean itself. He only owned the view, the resort, and most of the people seated around that table. A bottle of Krug rested beside his arm. His Vacheron watch reflected the candlelight each time he slowly reached for another oyster, making everyone wait before speaking. I've arranged for you to meet Preston Vance on Saturday, he said without looking up. The Vance merger is almost complete. It will help if the two of you are seen together. I quietly placed my fork down. My grandfather had taught me that whenever I needed to stay calm, I should keep my hands busy. Without thinking, I reached into my bag and rubbed my thumb across the old brass calipers Walter had given me the year before he passed away. I'm seeing someone, Dad, I said. It's serious. That immediately caught his attention. Who is he? What family does he come from? You don't know him. The candles crackled softly. My mother's smile stiffened. My father carefully set down the oyster he had been enjoying and looked at me the same way he examined a property he had decided not to purchase. In this family, he said, marriage is a merger. Feelings are for people who can't afford strategy. I never told him Owen's name. I didn't explain that Owen would never belong at that table, and to me, that was the greatest compliment possible. I simply smiled and let the silence remain because some answers are meant to be delivered later, in front of a much larger audience. Of course, he investigated me. That's how the Porter family handled everything. 3 days later, I was called to his office on the top floor of the flagship resort. The floor-to-ceiling windows and oversized office were carefully designed to make visitors feel insignificant. A thin file rested on his desk. Owen Hale, my father read in a voice as cold as a legal document. Aircraft mechanic. Rents a hangar at a regional airfield. No real estate. Very few assets. No family connections worth mentioning. He closed the file and looked straight at me. So, this is the man you're willing to throw away the Vance merger for? Someone who repairs other people's engines. He's a good man, I answered. My father gave a faint smile. Good men don't create legacies, Fontaine. They work for the people who do. He stood, folded his hands behind his back, and faced the glass. Let me make this perfectly clear. Porters do not marry mechanics. I had heard that same emotionless voice years earlier when he refused to pay for my engineering degree because he believed engineering was an unsuitable hobby for a Porter daughter. So, I paid every tuition bill myself. I studied at night and on weekends. I built real things with my own hands while my sister was handed expensive dresses and glamorous parties. You taught me to build things, Dad, I said calmly. So don't be surprised that I built a life you don't approve of. He laughed once, short and dry. But there was one strange detail inside that investigation file that stayed with me for weeks. The investigator had found absolutely nothing. No debts. No scandals. No hidden past. For someone my father insisted was completely ordinary, Owen's history was unusually clean, almost as though it had been deliberately kept that way. At the time, I didn't understand why. I had met Owen 4 months earlier, and not at a party. I met him at work, the only place where I've ever truly felt like myself. A regional airfield hired my engineering firm to inspect the structure of an old hangar before expanding it. I spent the morning climbing through steel trusses with a flashlight and a notebook. The entire building vibrated with energy. When a jet engine starts 2 bays away, there's a deep rising sound that you feel in your chest before you even hear it. I loved that feeling the way other people love music. A man wearing grease-stained coveralls stood near the hangar doors, wiping his hands while watching me inspect a rusted gusset plate. The name stitched across his uniform read Tidewater, a regional company I vaguely recognized. "That plate has been fooling inspectors for nearly 10 years, he said. "Tell me what you see." So I told him, and instead of giving me the polite nod I expected from most people, he didn't just nod politely like most people would. Instead, he challenged my opinion. He proved me wrong once, I proved him wrong twice, and he openly admitted when I was right. We ended up talking for nearly 2 hours. Then he asked me a question no one in my family had ever cared to ask. What would you build if nobody was paying you and nobody was watching? That question stayed with me. When we left, he paid for our coffee in cash, pulling out a worn stack of bills, then led me past the fancy cafe nearby to a small diner with cracked vinyl booths. I noticed several pilots greeted him with far more respect than you'd expect for an ordinary line mechanic. I noticed it, stored it in the back of my mind, and let it go because he looked at me as though my work truly mattered. And at that point, my work was the most honest part of my life. As he walked me to my car, he smiled. "I don't care whose daughter you are." And for the first time in a long time, I believed someone completely. A few months later, he proposed inside the hangar. It couldn't have been a more perfect place because that was where I felt most like myself. There was no orchestra, no rooftop overlooking the city, and no expensive ring chosen by a luxury jeweler. Instead, he had crafted the ring himself on the lathe in the workshop behind the hangar. It was made from titanium, simple, strong, and just slightly imperfect where the seam met. His hands were shaking more than I'd ever seen before. "I can't give you the life they plan for you," he said quietly, "but I'll never make you feel small." I said yes before he could even finish the sentence. Telling my family was a completely different story. I gave them 2 months' notice, almost like warning someone before a controlled demolition. Within an hour, my sister Brooke had already heard. She posted a photo of a wrench to her 200,000 followers with the caption, "Bold choice. Hope love pays the bills," followed by a laughing emoji. Preston Vance, the man my father had chosen for me, started telling everyone he had escaped a disaster. My mother called but spent nearly a full minute saying nothing before she finally spoke. When my father called, he never raised his voice. Somehow, that was always worse. "So, you want a wedding?" he asked calmly.
"Fine.
I'll give you one you'll never forget." I should have recognized the threat hidden inside those words, but I didn't. I was happy, and happiness has a way of making you believe the best about people who haven't earned that trust. When I told Owen what my father had said, expecting him to be concerned, he simply nodded, calm as ever. "Let him plan whatever he wants," he said. "When it's over, we'll still be husband and wife." That level of confidence should have made me wonder who I was really marrying. It didn't. Not yet. 2 days later, my mother arrived carrying a stack of bridal magazines and wearing the expression of someone performing grief. Fontaine Porter treated sadness the way some women applied makeup, with patience, precision, and perfect lighting. She never asked whether I was happy. Instead, she asked, "Do you realize what people will say?" She dabbed at eyes that weren't actually wet. "Your father spent 30 years building this family name, and you're throwing it away for a man who smells like motor oil." I smiled. I've actually grown to love the smell of motor oil. She dropped the magazines onto the table as though they had offended her. "Don't make me choose, Fontaine." There it was. The same line she'd used my entire life. It always meant she'd already chosen my father and simply wanted me to apologize for noticing. Inside my bag, I squeezed Walter's old brass calipers until the rough edge pressed into my palm. He always used to tell me that measurements never cared about feelings, and neither should I. You already chose, Mom, I replied softly. You made that choice a long time ago. She flinched. For just a moment, the performance disappeared, and something real showed through. Before your grandfather died, she began. He asked me to make sure you. Then she stopped herself abruptly, like slamming a drawer before anyone could see what was inside. Never mind. Make sure I what? I asked. It doesn't matter anymore. She gathered her magazines, picked up her carefully rehearsed sorrow, and walked out. I sat there for a long time afterward, turning those unfinished words over in my mind like a machine part that refused to fit. Walter had wanted her to make sure of something about me, and she had decided I would never hear the rest. The first sign came at a fabric shop while I was paying for wedding samples. My credit card was declined. Then the second one failed. A few days later, the consulting stipend I received from the family foundation simply disappeared. There was no email, no phone call, just a balance that suddenly became zero. By the end of that week, my father had cut every financial connection that led back to him, quietly and efficiently, like repossessing a car in the middle of the night so the neighbors wouldn't notice. The society friends disappeared too. That silence hurt more than an argument ever could. One message read, "I'm so sorry. You understand, my father does business with yours." Another simply said, "Nothing personal." 28 years of friendships had been reduced to a few dismissive words. But my father made one mistake, the same mistake powerful, arrogant men often make. He believed taking away my money meant taking away my strength. He was wrong. I didn't cry in that fabric store. I went home, opened a spreadsheet, and did what I'd been trained to do. I calculated first and panicked later. Rent, groceries, my savings, consulting contracts. Every number went onto the page. The numbers showed I still had consulting work I could pursue that had nothing to do with the Porter name. The budget was tight, but it worked. That evening, Owen found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by spreadsheets. He quietly offered to pay for everything. I shook my head. No. I need to prove I can stand on my own first. Then we can stand together. He never argued. He simply rested a hand on my shoulder and let me keep working. My father had canceled my credit cards, but he couldn't cancel my skills, my engineering license, or the mind he'd spent years pretending wasn't worth much. Soon, we moved into a small clapboard house near the airfield. It was the kind of home my mother would have called charming while forcing a smile. It had warm afternoon sunlight, a cozy porch, and a tiny kitchen that barely fit two people. I loved that little house more than any mansion I'd ever lived in. But Owen, the more time I spent with him, the more I realized something didn't quite add up. Late at night, he often stepped onto the porch to answer phone calls in a quiet voice. The conversations didn't sound like they belonged to an aircraft mechanic. Push the maintenance window. I'll handle the board. Don't involve legal yet. A mechanic doesn't usually have a board of directors. I never asked because we'd made a promise early in our relationship. We would earn each other's truths instead of demanding them. The next morning, one of his coworkers left behind an aviation trade magazine on our kitchen table. The cover story was about a private aviation company and its mysterious billionaire founder who still preferred turning his own wrenches instead of sitting behind a desk. There wasn't even a photo of his face, only a gloved hand resting on a turbine blade. I glanced at it, assumed it was simply another interesting business story, poured myself another cup of coffee, and moved on. Standing in the doorway, Owen watched me with an expression I couldn't understand. It looked like hope, mixed with fear, like a man waiting to see whether the person he loves is about to discover a secret. "Money is only a tool, Fontaine," he said quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I'd rather you trust the man than the toolbox." I laughed. "You sound like a fortune cookie." He smiled, but he didn't laugh. Much later, I realized he'd told me the truth right to my face. I simply wasn't ready to hear it. If you've ever been told your decisions embarrassed your family, then you already know exactly how this feels. Leave a comment and tell me if anyone has ever judged your value by your bank account. And if you're enjoying the story, subscribe because my father's confidence wouldn't last much longer, and the moment it finally shattered was worth every second. Now back to the story. We had planned a simple wedding, a small chapel by the water, 50 chairs, only the people who truly cared about us. Instead, when we arrived, the parking lot was overflowing with luxury cars. My father had secretly invited 200 guests from his own social circle. He had even printed an elaborate seating chart on thick cream-colored cards displayed at the entrance. When I found our table assignments, I immediately understood his message. Owen wasn't seated with me. He had been placed alone at the very back of the room beside the emergency exit beneath a sign that read, "Guest, not groom." The room was filled with expensive perfume and even more expensive arrogance. Preston Vance stood against a nearby column, holding a glass of amber liquor, watching me as though I were still a business deal he might somehow recover. My mother sat in the front row dressed in funeral gray. Brooke already had her phone raised before I reached the altar, quietly recording everything for her followers. I found Owen sitting exactly where the seating chart had exiled him. Yet, somehow, he looked like the calmest person in the entire building. "Your father certainly loves making a scene," he whispered. "He always has," I answered. "He just waits until the end."
We got married anyway.
Our vows belonged only to us. Simple, honest. For 90 beautiful seconds, my father's world disappeared. There was only Owen, me, the exhausted officiant, and the sound of the water outside the chapel windows.
Then,
a knife gently struck the side of a crystal glass. I turned around. My father was slowly rising from his chair at the head table he had practically crowned himself king of. He lifted his glass, cleared his throat, and smiled like a man preparing to grant someone an incredible honor. "A toast," he announced. The room instantly fell silent. Rooms always obey men like him. "To my daughter," he paused deliberately. "And to her husband." That tiny pause carried more insult than the words themselves. "I built everything this family owns from a single motel my own father lost," he continued, slowly walking through the room with his glass in hand while powerful guests watched every move. Every dollar was earned. Every opportunity was fought for. I had only one dream, that my daughter would carry this legacy forward beside someone worthy of our family name. He stopped beside Owen. He looked down at his clean but inexpensive suit, then at the grease-worn hands that had built far more than anyone in that room realized. "Instead," he said with a cold smile, "she chose a grease stain on the family name." The family name. A few people laughed. Phones immediately came up to record the moment. I saw Brooke swing her camera toward me, eager to capture my humiliation. "So let me do something useful," my father announced, turning toward the crowd as though he were delivering wonderful news. "As of today, Fontaine is no longer a Porter in any way that matters. She receives no inheritance, no trust fund, and not a single share of anything I've built. She's a mechanic's wife now, and she's welcome to enjoy the life she chose." He let the words settle. The room held its breath, waiting for me to fall apart. That was exactly the kind of entertainment his guests had come for. My mother gently dabbed at her eyes, but said nothing. She defended nothing. She did what she'd always done, acted wounded while quietly helping twist the knife. But I didn't break. I stood tall, just as Walter had taught me whenever a burden looked heavier than it really was. I let my father finish every word because I'd learned long ago that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least left to say. Then Owen stood up. Slowly.
Calmly.
The same way he did everything. Like a man who had never rushed simply because someone else was panicking. He buttoned his plain jacket, faced my father across the crowded room, and smiled. That smile made a chill run down my spine. Not because it was angry, because it was patient. "Thank you for the toast, Mr. Porter," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "And thank you for the inheritance speech." My father waited for him to beg. Instead, Owen calmly replied, "We don't need it. Just 4 simple words."
Clear.
Confident. The room stirred. My father laughed louder than necessary. "You don't need it? You rent a hangar." "I do," Owen answered. Best money I spend. Then my father asked, "And what exactly do you think you bring to my daughter's life?" Owen actually paused to think about it. Then he answered with one word: respect. After a brief silence, he added, "And the truth, when she's ready to hear it." Near the windows, an older gentleman wearing an elegant tailored suit quietly stood and gave Owen a respectful nod, the kind reserved for someone you willingly follow. I would later discover he was the executive who managed Owen's company every day. My father had no idea who the man was, but for the first time, his confidence wavered, just slightly, like the first tiny crack spreading through polished stone. It was the expression of a man who suddenly realized he'd miscalculated something, but still couldn't figure out what. "Porters don't marry mechanics," my father repeated, clinging to the words as if they were his last defense. Owen simply nodded, almost kindly. "You'll understand my work soon enough, sir," he said. "Everyone eventually does." Then he quietly sat back down beside me, slipped his hand into mine beneath the table, and gave it a gentle squeeze. For the first time that entire day, I knew the room was beginning to belong to us. My father had taken his shot. Now it was my turn. I didn't pick up a glass. I didn't tap a knife against crystal. I simply stood and faced the audience he had gathered against me. "My father believes a person's value comes from what they're born into," I said. I used to believe that too. I spent 28 years trying to become valuable enough for him. I let those words settle. I went to the right schools. I learned the right manners. I wore the right smile. And the greatest compliment he ever gave my work was calling it a hobby. Someone shifted uncomfortably. So, I paid for my own education. I studied during nights he never knew about. And I learned to build things that carry real weight. The kind that doesn't care what your last name is. I looked toward my mother. She couldn't meet my eyes. Today I didn't lose a family. I simply stopped auditioning for one. Silence filled the room. Then, someone near the middle began clapping. Another person joined. Then another. Soon far more people were applauding than my father had ever expected. Even several of his own guests. Perhaps because they, too, had spent years trying to earn someone's approval. I smiled gently. "The door is right there. If you came hoping to watch a tragedy, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is a wedding. You're welcome to stay and celebrate, or you're free to leave." My father's jaw tightened. He had built that entire room expecting to watch me collapse. Instead, the room quietly refused to play its assigned role. About 30 guests stood up and walked out. More than 200 stayed. That was the one outcome my father had never imagined. Because people who only understand power rarely understand dignity. And dignity spreads from person to person far faster than contempt ever can. A few moments later, my father walked out. My mother silently followed behind him. Brooke paused only long enough to film the centerpiece, as though even the flowers had somehow disappointed her. The instant the doors closed behind them, the entire room seemed to breathe again. The weight that had hung over everyone for the past hour simply disappeared. The guests who remained slowly relaxed. Conversation started. Laughter returned. Someone turned the music back on. A local caterer, one my father hadn't hired, brought out a simple white sheet cake from a neighborhood bakery. The buttercream wasn't perfect. The frosting line leaned slightly to one side. It was the best wedding cake I'd ever tasted. Maybe because no one around that table was pretending to be anyone else. Owen and I danced badly in the open space between the chairs. He rested his chin gently on the top of my head. "Any regrets?" he asked. "Not even for a second." "Even after the seating chart?" I smiled. "Especially after the seating chart." This time he laughed with his whole heart. Then his expression softened. "When the time is right," he said quietly, "I'm going to tell you everything about my work." "When the time is right," Owen said softly, "I'll tell you everything about my work." I stepped back and looked at him. "Why not now?" "Because if I told you now, you'd hear it differently," he replied. "I'd rather tell you while we're standing somewhere that proves it's true, instead of simply asking you to believe my words." I didn't press him. I trusted him. The music was playing, the cake had disappeared, and for one perfect evening nobody compared me to anyone else. What I didn't know was that the place Owen wanted to reveal the truth would be a stage in front of 500 people, and the worst seat in that room would belong to the man who had spent our wedding deciding where everyone else should sit. 2 weeks after the wedding, I received a call from a lawyer I'd never met. Her name was Ruth Maddox. She had represented my grandfather, Walter, for 30 years. Her office smelled of old books and lemon polish. She slid a thin file across her desk. "Your grandfather left specific instructions," she said. "These were to be given to you only after you married someone of your own choosing, without your father's approval. You fulfilled that condition 2 weeks ago." Inside the file was a single object wrapped carefully in cloth. Before I even opened it, I recognized the weight. It was Walter's finest set of brass calipers. The same pair I'd watched him use thousands of times. A perfect match to the worn set I still carried every day. Beneath them rested a handwritten letter in his careful drafting script. "He wrote this 14 months before he passed away," Ruth explained quietly. "He asked your mother to give it to you. Last spring she returned it to me unopened and instructed me to keep it sealed." I read every word twice. My grandfather had left me his old machine shop, the cinderblock building behind the original motel, where he'd first taught me how to measure properly. But that wasn't all. He had also left me a 12% ownership stake in a structural components company he had quietly invested in years earlier. According to the letter, that company had licensed the vibration damping bracket I had designed in high school and later patented while struggling through college. The very patent I'd completely forgotten about. "Has this actually been earning money?" I asked. Ruth smiled. "For roughly 6 years. I sat there holding those brass calipers until the metal became warm in my hands. In a single afternoon, I learned that my grandfather had secretly left me a workshop, part ownership of a successful company, and the value of an idea I'd created as a teenager. My mother had hidden every bit of it, locked inside a lawyer's office for almost a year. I didn't immediately tell Owen how much everything was worth. I wanted time to understand it first, just as an engineer studies a structure before trusting it. My father's influence had closed nearly every prestigious door in the state, but it turned out the opportunities one truly wanted had never depended on his name anyway. A marina hired me to inspect a failing dock. A community college asked me to evaluate an aging gym before installing a heavier roof. A small developer across the county gave me one project on Tuesday, then recommended me to 2 more clients by Friday. Good work has a way of creating its own reputation. No famous last name can compete with that. One afternoon, I unlocked Walter's old workshop for the first time in years. The air still carried the smell of cutting oil. Every tool remained exactly where he'd left it. I called the structural components company my grandfather had invested in and introduced myself as the engineer who designed the damping bracket. The man on the phone politely explained that my design was now being used in bridges, parking garages, and commercial structures across the country. Then he explained what 12% of 6 profitable years was worth. By my father's standards, it wasn't extraordinary wealth. By mine, it was something much better. It was freedom. Freedom built by my own mind. The very mind my family had spent decades dismissing as nothing more than a hobby. While they were busy deciding I was worthless, my own invention had quietly been earning money the entire time. That night, I finally told Owen. "It turns out," I said with a smile, "the thing they called a waste of time has been making money behind their backs for years." He smiled that familiar slow smile. "So, I guess you never needed anyone to rescue you." I never did. The moment I said it aloud, I realized it had always been true. Meanwhile, another story was dominating the business headlines. Porter Resorts was preparing to unveil its billion-dollar flagship coastal resort. The entire project revolved around one promise printed across every brochure. Private jet directly to your suite. No terminals. No waiting. A luxury experience designed for people wealthy enough to never think about ordinary travel. That promise depended entirely on one exclusive aviation partner. The company responsible for the airfield, the aircraft, and every operation behind the scenes. Its name appeared in every newspaper and industry magazine. Meridian Aviation Group. When I read that name, it felt strangely familiar, like seeing a word you've encountered before, but can't quite remember where. The name barely registered at first, just another familiar phrase buried inside an industry headline that reminded me of a sign I'd once seen hanging outside a maintenance hangar. But every article highlighted the same detail. My father had spent nearly 2 years pursuing Meridian Aviation Group, trying to secure the signature of a chairman so secretive that no journalist had ever managed to meet him in person. According to the reports, the agreement was only days away from being finalized. Without that partnership, my father's flagship resort couldn't deliver the exclusive private aviation experience it had already promised to a waiting list of billionaire clients. That evening, Owen stepped inside from the porch just as the distant whine of a jet engine rose across the airfield. It was the same steady, climbing sound I'd loved ever since the day we first met. For a brief moment, the sound and the name Meridian connected in my mind. Then I dismissed the thought. It felt far too unbelievable to be true. "Busy day?" I asked. "A few contracts," he replied while setting down his keys. "One especially important deal is finally reaching the finish line." I mentioned reading about my father's luxury resort and how he still hadn't managed to secure the aviation company everyone was talking about. Owen calmly filled 2 glasses with water. "Is that so?" he said with a faint smile before smoothly changing the subject. I didn't question it because I still hadn't put all the pieces together. Let me pause for a second, because this is where everything begins to change. For 2 years, my father had been desperately trying to meet a business partner who had breakfast at my kitchen table every morning and washed jet fuel from his hands in my sink. If you've ever watched an arrogant person walk directly into a trap built by their own pride, keep listening. You're not going to want to miss what comes next. The following Sunday, Owen invited me onto the porch. 2 cups of coffee sat between us. We shared a long silence before he finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "And I'm probably going to explain it badly, because I've never had to before." I simply waited. "The mechanic part is real," he began. "I work on engines because it keeps me grounded. It's the only place where my mind truly becomes quiet." "But that's not everything you do," I replied. He gave a small smile. "No," he admitted. "I'm not poor, Fawn. Actually, it's the exact opposite, and that's not an easy thing to explain over coffee." He slowly turned his mug in his hands. "I started a company with 1 aircraft and a lease I could barely afford. It kept growing, then it grew beyond anything I ever imagined. Eventually, I stopped allowing photographs of myself because once people know how much you're worth, they stop being honest. Instead, they become whatever they think you want to see." His eyes met mine. "I needed someone to love me before they knew the numbers."
You did.
"You fell in love with a mechanic. Do you know what that means to someone like me?" Suddenly, every unanswered question returned. The late-night business calls. The unusual respect pilots always showed him. The magazine featuring nothing but a gloved hand resting on a turbine blade. All the clues I'd ignored because the truth seemed impossible. "Are you finally going to tell me the name of your company?" I asked. "Not yet," he answered gently. "I don't want you to hear it first. I want you to see it. 6 weeks from now, there's an event. I want you beside me. Once we walk through those doors, everything will make sense." He reached into his jacket and placed a thick cream-colored envelope on the table. Gold lettering shimmered across the front. Inside was an invitation to a grand opening. The host wasn't Porter Resorts. It was Meridian Aviation Group, the same company my father had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to win over. "I never lied about who I was," Owen said softly. "I simply never introduced myself with my bank account." That night, sleep never came. Long after Owen had drifted off, I lay awake replaying every conversation we'd ever had. Around 2 in the morning, I carried my laptop to the kitchen and searched the company listed on the invitation. Meridian Aviation Group. Founder. Chairman. Every article repeated the same description. Private. Reclusive. Never photographed in public. One profile referred to him as the billionaire who still enjoys turning his own wrenches. Then I saw it again. That familiar photograph of a gloved hand resting against a turbine blade. No face. Just the hand I'd watched perform that exact motion hundreds of times inside the hangar that had slowly become my second home. I sat frozen. Tidewater, the name stitched across Owen's coveralls, was a Meridian subsidiary. The cash payments. The pilots who instinctively stood straighter whenever he walked by. The casual way he spoke about board meetings. The ease with which he rearranged maintenance schedules with a single phone call. Nobody casually changes an airline's operations unless, in one way or another, that airline belongs to them. I pictured my father sitting inside his towering glass office after spending 2 years chasing a signature from a man whose face he'd never even seen. And in the darkness, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because the entire picture had finally come into focus. My husband wasn't just another mechanic. He was the chairman. For 2 long years, my father had practically begged for the approval of the very man he'd publicly mocked as nothing more than a grease-stained mechanic at our wedding. I quietly closed the laptop without waking Owen. I remained there until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. Somewhere across the field, another jet engine slowly came alive. That familiar rising sound no longer reminded me of music.
Now.
It sounded like the beginning of a countdown. Meanwhile, my family sensed that the grand opening was approaching and decided to make one last attempt to repair the Porter family image before the cameras arrived. Preston Vance, still bitter that I'd chosen a mechanic instead of him, quietly spread rumors through the city's wealthiest circles. The smear campaign spread exactly where it was supposed to, through the right social circles. The kind of rumor passed quietly over cocktails and dinner tables. Preston painted Owen as a gold digger, just another mechanic who had married into money and stumbled into good fortune. It was a polished lie, but it was aimed at the wrong person.
Preston simply didn't know that yet.
Brooke, who never missed an opportunity to profit from a trend, reposted clips from my wedding with brand new commentary, turning my father's toast into entertainment for an audience that kept growing every day. She had no idea she was sharing the very video that would soon destroy both her reputation and her father's. That's the thing about people who record everything. They never imagine the camera eventually turning back on them. Then my mother called. Her voice was as sweet as poured honey.
There's still time, she said.
Your father hasn't officially changed the will. If you come home before the grand opening, before the press arrives, we can put all of this behind us. People are talking, Fontaine. She didn't ask whether I was happy. She didn't say she was sorry for hiding my grandfather's letter for an entire year. Instead, all she cared about was that people were gossiping, cameras were coming, and I had become a stain they wanted erased before the photographs were taken. I held the phone and felt that familiar ache, the 28 years I'd spent hoping she'd finally choose me. Then, for the first time, I felt that weight disappear, because I finally understood something. Choosing me had never been something she was capable of doing. I'll be at the opening, Mom, I replied, just not in the way you're expecting. She heard only what she wanted to hear. She believed her daughter was finally coming home. She ended the call happy, and I didn't correct her. Some people only hear the version of you that's most convenient for them, and there's no point arguing until the evidence speaks for itself. Here's the part of the story I'm proudest of, and it has nothing to do with my husband. A few days after my mother's call, my engineering firm received an email that made me set my coffee down. The general contractor for the flagship resort needed the structural engineer of record to approve the signature overwater pavilion, the dramatic cantilevered glass room extending above the ocean, the same room featured in every promotional brochure. A colleague had recommended me by name, completely unaware or unconcerned that the resort belonged to my father. I drove to the site, inspected the steel framing, and discovered 2 connection details I refused to approve until they were corrected. That meant the most photographed space in my father's billion-dollar project could not legally open until my professional seal appeared on the drawings. And my seal never went on anything I hadn't personally inspected. Think about that for a moment. The daughter he'd erased from his life possessed the one signature his grand opening absolutely required. And she'd earned that authority through a professional license he had never contributed a single dollar toward. I want to make one thing perfectly clear because it's the entire point of this story. I never threatened to withhold my approval. I never used it as leverage. I simply did my job the right way, the way Walter taught me. Once the corrections were complete and everything met the proper standards, I signed the drawings. Because before I'm anyone's daughter, I'm an engineer. And a building suspended 40 feet above the ocean doesn't care about family conflict. When people step inside, it either stands safely or it doesn't. So when I walked into that grand opening, it wasn't as the disowned daughter quietly arriving on her husband's arm. I walked in as the engineer whose calculations were holding up the very room where everyone would soon be raising champagne glasses. I'm not attending as somebody's wife, I told Owen that evening. I'm going as the engineer who certified that his building won't collapse into the ocean. He looked at me for several long seconds before giving a slow nod, the kind he always gave whenever pride made words unnecessary. The night before the opening, Owen and I had the only real argument we'd ever had in our marriage. Even then, it stayed quiet. You should have told me sooner, I said. I know. For 2 years he chased you. You let him. I let business determine who it worked with, he answered. Your father received the same response everyone gets when they treat people like inventory. He just never realized I was the one giving it. I was angry, but beneath that anger was something even harder to admit. I felt like I'd been managed, even if he'd done it gently. There's a difference, I said, between protecting yourself and keeping me in the dark. There is, he admitted.
He didn't argue.
He didn't defend himself. And somehow, that was the only response capable of cooling my anger. I hid what I owned, he said quietly. I never hid how I felt. If that isn't enough, tell me now. It was enough. Deep down, I'd known it all along. You know a structure is solid the same way. You don't trust emotion.
You verify it.
Tomorrow, I finally said, we're not going to humiliate him. Owen lifted an eyebrow. I mean it. We won't twist the knife. We won't turn it into a spectacle. So what do? He asked. We stop hiding, I answered. We let the truth stand in front of everyone and speak for itself. That's enough. It has always been enough. He stayed quiet for a moment before reaching over and picking up my grandfather's old calipers, the worn pair I still kept beside my bed. Walter would have liked you tonight, he said. I smiled. Walter would have liked you from the very beginning. He started out as a mechanic, too. Owen smiled back. The argument faded into the darkness between us. And long after he had fallen asleep, I remained awake, imagining the expression on my father's face when everything finally came to light. The chairman my father had spent 2 years desperately trying to meet finally stepped into the spotlight. At that moment, I made myself a promise. No matter what I felt, I would keep it to myself. Because the loudest person in the room is almost always the one who's already losing. The flagship resort was breathtaking. I'll give my father that much. The entire structure had been built into the dunes so perfectly that it looked as though it floated above the shoreline. And the overwater pavilion, my pavilion, cast a warm glow across the dark ocean like a lantern suspended over the waves. 500 guests filled the venue. The governor was there. Major investors, many with foundations of their own. Journalists wearing press credentials clipped neatly to elegant clothing. And just inside the entrance stood an easel displaying the seating chart. Of course there was one. My father had never hosted an event without carefully arranging everyone's place in the hierarchy. I scanned the chart the same way I'd studied the seating plan at my wedding. Then my eyes stopped on a single listing near the middle. Chairman's table, Meridian Aviation Group. For seats. Completely empty. Reserved for the man my father still believed he was finally going to meet and impress. Owen rested a warm hand against the small of my back. I wore black. Simple lines. No apologies. Inside my handbag rested my grandfather's brass calipers. I no longer attended important moments without them. My father noticed us from across the ballroom. He walked over quickly, already wearing the polished smile he always used when closing business deals. And suddenly I realized something almost unbelievable. He truly believed my mother had been right. He thought I'd come home. He believed the daughter he disowned had returned just in time to appear in the family photographs. Fontaine, he said warmly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. His eyes shifted briefly toward Owen. I'm surprised they even let your husband through valet. Owen didn't answer. He simply offered that familiar patient half-smile. Above us, the sound of a turbine engine slowly accelerating filled the speakers. The opening presentation had begun. The rising mechanical whine vibrated through the room. Then, the lights dimmed. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. He spoke the sentence my father had waited 2 years to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, for the very first time, the chairman of Meridian Aviation Group will appear in person. My father turned toward the stage with the eager expression of a man convinced he was moments away from meeting the business partner who would complete his greatest achievement. Behind the podium, the giant screens came to life. White letters slowly appeared. Meridian Aviation Group, founder and chairman. The turbine sound climbed to its highest pitch, then stopped. Silence. Owen released my hand. He looked at me once. A quiet, private look. The look of a man finally allowed to stand where the truth could no longer be hidden. Then he walked toward the stage. I watched my father's face do something I'd spent my entire life hoping to see, until I'd finally stopped believing it ever would. It didn't shatter. It simply became empty. The color drained away from his face, as though someone had poured the life out of him. His champagne glass tilted in his hand. The drink spilled across his sleeve. He never even noticed. My mother instantly covered her mouth. Brooke, the woman who filmed absolutely everything, lowered her phone for what might have been the first time in her adult life. She simply stared. 500 people rose to their feet together. A wave of applause rolled across the ballroom for the famously unseen man who had finally revealed himself. Yet in the middle of all that celebration, my father stood perfectly still. Alone. Unable to move. The mechanic he'd mocked during my wedding now stood beneath the spotlight as one of the most respected men in the industry. And the daughter he'd erased from his life watched quietly from the audience, hands folded, completely calm. The host leaned toward the microphone. Please welcome the man who never shows his face. Owen Hale. My husband. The mechanic from the hangar that had always smelled like home. He looked across the room, at the ruins of everything my father had believed. Then he began speaking. His remarks were brief, entirely professional. He thanked the audience. He praised the engineers, mechanics, and technicians who had done the real work. And he didn't mention my family even once. That silence hurt them more than any speech ever could. The moment he stepped off the stage, people surrounded him.
Investors.
A senator's aide. Magazine editors. Everyone suddenly wanted to meet the man whose identity had been a mystery for years. My father reached him first. Desperation always moves faster than dignity. Owen, he said, extending his hand with a smile carefully crafted for everyone listening nearby. This is incredible. I always told Fontaine she had excellent taste. Owen never accepted the handshake. What about our partnership? My father continued. The flagship project. Our conversations over the last 2 years. Surely now that we're... He made a vague gesture between us. Family, we can finalize everything tonight. Owen looked at the hand still hanging in the air. Then he looked directly into my father's eyes. He answered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. I received your proposal months ago, Mr. Porter. I declined it. My father frowned. But why? It's the obvious business decision. Owen's expression never changed. Because Meridian doesn't enter partnerships with people who treat their own family like inventory to be discarded in front of an audience. He said it calmly, without anger, which somehow made every word even heavier. Just behind him stood the seating chart my father himself had insisted on displaying. The chairman's table. Owen's name rested plainly on the place card. For empty chairs had been waiting all evening. For the very man my father had publicly dismissed as nothing more than a stain. Without Meridian, the luxury resort lost its biggest attraction. No private aircraft, no executive fleet, no airfield operations. My father had already sold that exclusive experience to some of the richest guests in the country. Now he owned a billion-dollar resort with no airplanes arriving to complete the promise. Owen looked at him calmly. You had every opportunity to welcome me, he said. Instead, you chose to humiliate me with a microphone. My father shifted his attention from Owen to me. The polished businessman disappeared, replaced by the anger I'd watched him use all my life to dominate every room he entered. "You planned this," he said through clenched teeth. "You set me up. You let me stand in front of everyone and make a fool of myself. You humiliated your own father in front of 500 people." This was the moment everything in my life had been leading toward. But I'd promised myself something long before I arrived. The loudest person in any room is almost always the one who's already losing. And tonight, that person wasn't going to be me. I reached into my handbag and slowly removed my grandfather Walter's old brass calipers. Decades of work had polished the metal smooth. I held them where the lights reflected across the brass. "Do you know what these are, Dad?" He stared blankly. "They belong to Walter, your father. The man who built everything you own inside a machine shop with grease on his hands." His jaw tightened instantly. "At my wedding you proudly announced that porters don't marry mechanics." I slowly rotated the calipers in my fingers. The first porter who ever truly mattered was a mechanic. You spent your entire life pretending otherwise. The ballroom became completely silent. Several reporters lifted their recorders. For the first time that evening, my mother's performance disappeared. She simply looked frightened. "You told me I'd receive no inheritance." I continued evenly. "That's perfectly fine. I was never planning to inherit your legacy. I planned to build one greater than yours." Then I shared the truth that completely shattered what remained of his confidence. "One more thing. That overwater pavilion everyone will be photographing tonight can't legally open without my engineering approval." I smiled slightly. "I signed those drawings this afternoon." "You're welcome. I've always done excellent work." The damage spread faster than even my father's public relations team could contain it. Before the valet had even finished bringing vehicles around, Brooke's wedding video, the same clip she'd been reposting for laughs, was circulating online again. Only now everyone saw it differently. There was my father insulting his future son-in-law as nothing more than a greasy mechanic. And there was that same mechanic standing on stage as the billionaire chairman whose partnership my father had spent years desperately chasing. The internet did exactly what the internet always does. Guests quietly started leaving. Two major investors excused themselves before the evening ended. As one walked past, he quietly told my father, "Gerald, we'll need to reconsider our agreement." Even the governor's photographer quietly stopped taking family photographs. Later, I found Owen standing beside the glass walls of the pavilion I'd engineered, watching the waves beneath us. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. That simply wasn't who he was. "Are you all right?" he asked. I thought about 28 years of rejection. The birthday cards that never came. The hidden letter. The trap my father had carefully built, expecting me to fall apart in front of everyone. Then I smiled. "I'm better than all right." And for the first time, I truly meant it. I leaned against him and quietly repeated the same 4 words he'd whispered at our wedding, back when he had nothing my father respected. "We don't need it." Back then, those words protected us. Tonight, they were simply the truth. Long before I discovered Owen's secret, my own career had already made me independent. My grandfather's 12% ownership, the patent that quietly earned income for years, the engineering firm I built through honest work and reputation. Everything I'd become belonged to me. My father hadn't given me any of it, which meant he could never take it away. Near the coat check, my mother hurried toward me, already beginning another performance. "Fontaine, sweetheart, you have to believe me. I've always been on your side. I wanted to defend you at the wedding, but your father, you know how he is. I had to protect myself." I finished her sentence for her. "You had to protect yourself." She froze. I never raised my voice. I had promised myself I wouldn't raise my voice. "Ruth Maddox gave me Walter's letter, Mom," I said. "The one you kept hidden for an entire year. The workshop, the company, everything was in it. You buried Grandpa's final wishes because you were afraid they'd make me stop depending on Dad's approval." She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. "You always told me, don't make me choose, Fontaine." I looked straight into her eyes. "You made that choice the moment you locked that letter away." For once, she had no response. And strangely enough, Her silence was the most honest thing she'd offered me in years. A few moments later, Brooke walked over. Her mascara had run, and for the first time there wasn't a trace of arrogance on her face. "I didn't know about the letter," she admitted quietly. "And I'm exhausted, Fawn. I've spent so many years trying to be the perfect daughter that I don't even know who I am anymore." It was the closest she'd ever come to telling me the truth. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me wanted the sister I'd wished for my entire life. But a little honesty at the end of the story couldn't erase the camera she'd pointed at me during my wedding. "I believe you're tired," I told her softly. "I can even forgive you. But I won't hand you my truth again just so you can turn it into content." She nodded.
She didn't argue.
Behind us, my father was finally discovering the price of spending an entire lifetime confusing someone's value with their price tag. The flagship resort eventually opened, 2 months behind schedule. Without Meridian, the private aviation experience that had been its biggest selling point disappeared. The Billionaire waiting list quietly moved on to other destinations. The Porter resort survived. My father was far too wealthy and far too stubborn to collapse completely. But for the first time in decades, his board began asking difficult questions. And this time, the evidence was on video. A man who had spent 30 years being the loudest voice in every room suddenly found people falling silent whenever he entered. Not because they respected him, but because they didn't. Meanwhile, I kept building my own life. My engineering firm hired a second engineer, then a third. Owen still spent most weekends at the hangar and always came home smelling exactly like he had the day we first met. One evening, just before sunset, my father arrived at our small clapboard house. Alone. No chauffeur. No expensive car. No rehearsed speech. He stood quietly on the porch looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Can I?" he began before his voice cracked. "Can I apologize?" I let the silence sit between us. Not to punish him. Just long enough for honesty to have room. "I don't need an apology anymore, Dad," I answered. "I needed one years ago."
You didn't have it then.
He lowered his head. He understood. "What I need now," I continued, "is for the next 10 years of your life to matter more than this one sentence." He stared across the field at the fading sunlight, then back at me, the daughter he'd tried to erase, standing inside a life she'd built without him. "I don't know how," he admitted. It was the first completely truthful thing he'd said to me in decades. "Then learn," I replied. "Use your hands. Just like your father taught you before you convinced yourself you were better than where you came from." I didn't slam the door. I didn't invite him inside either. I simply left it open enough for him to understand the terms. He could be part of my life, but only if he learned how to be a father. Never again would he be the man who mistook money for love. There wasn't some dramatic family reunion. No magical holiday where years of pain disappeared overnight. Real lives don't heal that way. And I'm an engineer. I don't trust anything that claims to bond instantly. These days, my mother sends thoughtful letters. Careful ones. She's still learning the distance between us. Brooke and I exchange occasional texts. Simple conversations. Two sisters trying to know each other without an audience watching. Sometimes my father visits on Sunday afternoons. He sits quietly inside Walter's old workshop while I work. Most days he simply watches. Every now and then he'll point at a tool and ask what it does. I explain it, and he listens. Something he never once did when I was the daughter he wanted to change. It isn't a fairy tale. It's something better. It's real. Built back together one careful step at a time by people willing to do the work without keeping score. Most evenings you'll still find me inside my grandfather's machine shop. The very place my mother tried to keep hidden from me. The place I only found because I married a mechanic. Walter's brass calipers now hang above my workbench. His pair beside mine, both catching the last light of the evening. Owen is usually out at the airfield. Across the water, I can hear a jet engine winding up. Once that sound felt like music. Later it sounded like a countdown.
Now,
it simply sounds like my husband coming home. My father called me decorative. My mother called me a problem that needed managing. The truth is, They were measuring me with the wrong tool. So let me leave you with the lesson Walter quietly taught me long before anyone else had the chance. An inheritance is something another person gives you. Your worth is something you build yourself. And nobody can ever disown what you created with your own hands. That's my story. A canceled invitation, a borrowed hanger, a hidden letter, and a name I finally realized I didn't need. If this story reminded you that your value has never belonged to anyone else, let it inspire you to build something with your own hands. Share it with someone who needs that reminder. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.